All right, everybody, what's up? I am here with Professor Nado, and we are here today to talk about intuitions and their role in philosophy. So, Professor Nado, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, and all that before we get started?
Cool. So first of all, thanks for having me. I'm Jenny Nado. I am a professor at the University of Hong Kong. I got my PhD from Rutgers a really long time ago. My research area is metaphilosophy generally. So I work on experimental philosophy. I don't actually do experiments. I really more work on the sort of philosophical side of things rather than the actual empirical side of things. But I work on experimental philosophy, the role of intuitions in philosophy, and more recently I've been working on conceptual engineering.
Awesome. All right. So today the goal will be to talk about some of the sort of foundational questions about intuitions, what they are, how philosophers use them, that sort of thing. So there's all the conceptual engineering stuff, the implications for experimental philosophy, and if we somehow amazingly get to that, maybe I could ask about that. But uh, if you could lay the groundwork, I don't even know how to frame this question because I could ask the question, how do philosophers talk about intuitions? But that itself is like, well, in 1,000 different ways. So I'll just hand it over to you. How do philosophers talk about intuitions? Can you situate us in that landscape?
Yeah, so it does depend on whether you're talking about like meta philosophers talking about intuitions or just, your average ethicist or your average, person working on epistemology or something like that. The way it's gone in metaphilosophy is that there was a sort of spike of interest in talking about intuition starting in like the late 1990s. And right around that time is right when experimental philosophy came out as well. But people had started kind of talking about intuitions and their nature and their evidential status and things like that a couple of years before experimental philosophy really came onto the scene. And if you look back at some of the literature right around that time, you really do get this very intuition heavy picture of the way that philosophy operates, right? People will say like, okay, what do philosophers use as evidence? They use intuitions. What do we do with these intuitions? Well, we sort of consult them and we sort of try to come up with a theory that captures the most intuitions possible, right? And it was this very kind of almost like stereotypical kind of picture of the way philosophy operates. I'm talking about like right around 2000-ish. Since then, things have kind of developed in a bunch of different directions, which I'm sure we'll touch on as we go forward. But right around 2010, 2015, somewhere around there, people started getting a little bit more skeptical about the degree to which philosophers actually use intuition in philosophy at all. And one of the things that got noticed right around this time, and this is in books by Hermann Kaplan and Max Deutsch in particular, is just that philosophers outside of the metaphilosophy circles don't actually talk about intuitions as much as you'd expect them to, right? So when you have somebody presenting a thought experiment, they don't always say, oh, and here is my intuition about this thought experiment. One thing that Max Deutsch pointed out is that if you go back to Gettier's article, which is often cited as like a prime example of intuition mongering, the word intuition doesn't even appear in the entire article. So I think there is a bit of a gap between the way philosophers actually talk and the sort of theorizing about what might be going on under the hood.
Yeah, do you think that, because the obvious criticism I could imagine a proponent of, and maybe I'll play a bit of devil's advocate for the proponents of intuition and the like centrality that intuitions are used as evidence in philosophy, is they might say, okay, well, maybe people weren't using the term intuition, but terminology can shift underneath our feet while the methodological or procedural landscape remains largely the same. What if, Gettier and others were invoking or presumptively employing intuition, but they just weren't using the terminology?
I think that's exactly what's going on, actually. I mean, if you think about the way that we normally talk about our evidential sources, we don't always say like, here is what I think, and I base this on seeing it, and I base this on testimony. I mean, we might say it for testimony because that's more indirect. But if somebody just says, okay, I'm going to describe a thought experiment, and here's what's true about that thought experiment, well, that's not very much different from going outside, looking up at the sky, and saying it's going to rain, and not mentioning that your basis for believing that is seeing clouds, something like that, right? So we're not always very explicit about the actual evidential processes that support our beliefs. And I think that's true in philosophy a lot more than we expected it to be. So at the same time, I don't think that at all shows that we're not relying on intuitions, right? It's just a quirk of how much we happen to discuss our evidential support, or the ways in which we
Right.
discuss our evidential support.
But to be fair to Capellan and others, there's like other reasons why they're skeptical of intuitions, right?
Oh,
Like
definitely. Yeah,
the degree to which
there's
they're used.
several. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So before we get into that, we gotta address
Mm.
this question, like what is it that we're even talking about? What are intuitions? And you
Mhm.
know, so I'm also in the field of psychology, and you know, if Kahneman and Tversky or other people in psychology, Gigerenzer and others, are talking about intuition, they're using it in this like system one, system two type thing.
Yes.
Then there's the colloquial, like the ordinary language use of intuition, like a hunch or gut feeling. Uh,
Mhm.
how does the philosophical use of the term intuition play with those other terms? What is its relation to those other terms? Is it identical to them? Is it different? In what ways does it differ? Like we
Mhm.
got all these different uses both
Yeah,
within and
yeah.
outside of philosophy. So we gotta sort of thread those needles.
Right. I think a lot of philosophers do, kind of in the back of their minds, have a lot of the features of system one cognition kind of in mind when they're talking about intuition. So, in particular, these mental states seem to be very automatic, and they seem to be such that we're not aware of how we got to them, right? We're not aware of the reasoning that went into them. And, that's a kind of system one sort of characterization of what an intuition might look like. But then you've also got the people who have worked on metaphilosophy and have tried to, get a little more theoretical about what constitutes an intuition. And they'll have various sort of criteria in their own personal kind of definitions of intuition that might be more strict. Right. So some people point to a very specific kind of phenomenology, right? This intellectual seeming kind of idea, which might not make much sense to your average psychologist or your average kind of person on the street just talking about their own intuitions. There's also one thing that I think that's particular to philosophy is an emphasis on the a priori of intuitions. I think if you look at the way the word intuition is used by ordinary folks just all the time, they're often talking about, intuitions about how their friend will react if they say such and so, right? But these things are very clearly like based on empirical experience. This is not the sort of thing that a philosopher has in mind when they're talking about intuition, right? Generally, a philosopher is thinking about sort of an a priori source of evidence, and not something that is just maybe a shortcut from all your years of a posteriori kind of experience.
Yeah. So what are some of the rough ways that they've categorized them? Because I've seen stuff like inclination to believe,
Mm,
there's
yeah.
emphasis on seemings. So what are some of the broad categories that they've sort of plopped intuitions into?
Right. So the most basic one would be to say it's like a type of belief, right? Obviously, not all beliefs are intuitions, but you might think that there's a subcategory of beliefs that are the intuitive ones. That's one way people have gone. Another way is to say that it's its own sort of different sort of propositional attitude that's maybe belief-like, but not a belief in of itself. So this is, Beeler would say something like this, that it's its own type of propositional attitude sitting alongside belief, desire, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have people who think it's more like an inclination, a sort of pull towards belief that could be resisted or overridden or something like that. You can even get certain uses of the word intuition that seem to refer to the things intuited rather than the mental state per se, right? So you can say, oh, okay, the fact that Gettier cases are not knowledge is an intuition, right? Rather than the mental state being the intuition. So there's a lot of variety, and I actually think this is something that complicates discussion and that is not kept as clear as it ought to be sometimes, because presumably all these things kind of exist, right? There is a mental state, there is a sort of inclination, there is, the thing intuited, and a lot of times these get run together in kind of unhelpful ways.
Yeah. What do you think is going on here? So yeah, what puzzles me about all this is like philosophers, and we're presumably talking largely about analytic philosophy here. Uh, there's a lot of emphasis on precision and clarity, and yet
Yeah.
the notion of intuition is so muddled, and it seems to be so heterogeneous what different people are referring to.
Hmm.
How did this happen? What is going on here?
Well, I do sort of wonder if it's just a little newer than we think it is talking about intuitions, right? In part, I think, well, analytic philosophy is not even that old to start with, right? You might go back all the way to Plato and say, like, Plato was relying on intuitions, but Plato, I don't think, had any word that corresponded to intuitions in the way we would use it. And then you look at somebody like Kant, he's going to be using intuition in quite a different way. So the sort of modern or contemporary discussion of intuitions is pretty recent. So it's not like we're relying on distinctions that have been around for a really long time, like a priori versus a posteriori. We're still kind of working through these details. It's really only about 25 years ago that people started to even that metaphilosophy even started to focus on intuitions and started trying to really get into what these things were.
Okay. And what is your sense of how much meta philosophy interact, like how, so, okay, let me back up a second. So you
Yeah.
mentioned earlier that philosophers themselves use intuition talk a lot less frequently than we might suppose. And meta philosophers now have shifted, like it's one of the biggest topics in meta philosophy is talking about intuitions. Uh, do you see much interaction between people doing meta philosophy and talking about intuitions and philosophers that don't really directly do or engage with meta philosophy? Like, how much is meta philosophy like influencing them, and how much engagement is there?
Oh, I do think it is kind of, there's a bit of osmosis, right? I think people do kind of pick up on what's going on in meta philosophy a little bit more than they would for other more specialized fields, right? Your average ethicist might not know much about what's going on in formal epistemology, but your average ethicist might know that there is this thing called experimental philosophy that's been sort of, or some branches of it have been critical of the use of intuitions. Your average ethicist might have heard of, some of the debates, even if they don't really, know too much what's going on. I do find that it gets a lot of interest if you present like a talk on meta philosophy. Everybody can kind of join in really easily, right? It's not a very technical thing to have to. You don't need a lot of background information. You just need kind of a reflection on your own discipline, and it's relevant to everyone who is a philosopher working on philosophy. So it's the sort of thing that has a broader interest than some of the more specialized subfields. And I do think you get at least a little bit of kind of general awareness of what's going on in metaphilosophy from that. Although I can't really say how much, just being an insider.
Yeah, you mentioned like this, like technical use. So, do you think of philosophy? Sorry, do you think of the term intuition as it's used in philosophy as like a technical term? Because there's like the technical term, and then there's the ordinary language use of the term. But there is this paper from Bingson where he talks about like the discriminative use
Yeah.
of intuition. Are you? I don't know if you're familiar with that, or is that
Yeah,
something?
yeah, I am. I mean, let me just recap my understanding of it, and you can double check me. But the idea being that, like, when we're talking about intuition as philosophers, we're talking about something that's kind of a little bit more precise than the ordinary usage. So we've like narrowed it down a little bit, but we're not going full technical jargon, right? Is that the basic idea?
Yeah, yeah. And so the idea would be that like certain technical terms you would propose, like, I don't know, mitochondria. That's not something that
Mm.
people would typically go around going, my mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell or whatever. Like
Yeah.
people, it's something you got to learn. It's not just part of
Yeah.
ordinary language.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's not this term that is proposed, that's not already a part of ordinary language that you then use in some technical context, nor are philosophers just taking the ordinary language term and just using it in the full-blooded sense that it's used in
Yeah.
those contexts, but rather they're saying, okay, out of all the terminology, all the ways the term intuition is employed in ordinary language, we're picking out this one. The concepts are
Yeah.
sort of nascent, they're present there, and they're just identifying those specific usages and employing it.
I honestly think like that's what a lot of philosophy does, like very broadly. So I mean, we might make the same argument that that's what we do for the term knowledge or something like that, right? We might use it in a somewhat stricter sense than the ordinary person on the street does, but we're still trying to get at what's underlying that ordinary usage. That said, probably philosophers are a bit more strict. Like the use of intuition by philosophers is probably a bit more narrowed from the ordinary usage, just because ordinary usage, like I said before, it does often it does often refer to a lot of states that are very clearly based on empirical experience, which is something philosophers have generally wanted to exclude when you're talking about philosophical intuitions.
Yeah, my reaction to that is, like, for instance, if philosophers draw a distinction between necessary a priori judgments versus, empirical or a posteriori, but regular people don't, I don't see how it could be discriminative or picking out some use if that distinction just isn't operative in ordinary language.
Right. Well, I guess it depends on how much that's central to the definition of what an intuition is. I mean, for some people, that's going to be really important. But then you have other people who are, maybe a little more skeptical of the distinction between a priori and a posteriori itself. And you've got complications here, too, because, you've got the sort of the classic issue that pretty much any a priori knowledge is going to rely on a lot of empirical knowledge just to acquire the concepts involved, right? So if I have an intuition that the Gettier case is not a case of knowledge, what parts of that are, a priori insight into Platonic heaven, and what parts of that are just a lot of accumulated experience about how people use the term, and a lot of accumulated experience about what sorts of mental states are more useful for navigating the world and various things like that. So I would actually tend to be a little bit more on the skeptical side, and kind of think that there's a lot of blurring that ought to be done between the notion of intuition as this kind of like a priori only kind of stuff, and the kind of ordinary usage, which is much more permissive of states that are clearly based primarily on experience. That said, I do tend to be a little bit restrictive, right? I wouldn't think that, your intuition about how your friend is likely to react to a certain claim or something like that is the intuition type that we're after, right? That's something a little bit more just your first up reaction.
Right. Okay. So I want to get into some of the stuff you get into in your paper, why intuitions, or why intuition. So you move into discussing you eventually get to the empirical research on the heterogeneity of the psychological processes that are potentially involved in intuition. But I feel like there's probably some things that we need to say to bridge us to get to that point. One of the things I thought was really helpful is you referencing Beeler, and Beeler having this rather distinctive and specific characterization of intuition, which maybe you don't see from a lot of philosophers, but there you got one. And how that brings in the generality problem and all of that stuff. So I don't know where to start with all that, but maybe you could walk us through how we get to this point of discussing the processes involved, or what's causing these intuitions.
Right. So maybe the way to approach this is to think about the dialectic as a whole, as the way that it was sort of developing in the early years of the 21st century, right, when people started using experimental philosophy findings to sort of critique philosophical methodology. There were kind of two assumptions that I think were maybe ill-advised, but are still fairly prevalent. The first of which is that what we are evaluating, right, is intuition, this sort of completely monolithic mental capacity of some sort. And then the second sort of assumption that went into these debates as they were developing is that what we are trying to assess is that capacity's reliability, right? So the central question is something like, is intuition reliable or not, right? And that's something that experimental philosophers were prone to kind of putting the issues in that way, but also people who were opponents of experimental philosophy were also prone to framing the problem exactly in this way, right? We've got this capacity, intuition, is it reliable, is it unreliable? And I really don't like that framing of the question for a lot of reasons. And this paper that you're referring to is maybe one of my first stabs at why I didn't like the framing of the question. And the thing that bothered me about it was, well, if you're assessing this capacity for its reliability, well, reliability is relative to the sort of process type that you are thinking about, right? So you can sort of carve mental processes either more narrowly or more broadly, and whether you carve them more narrowly or more broadly is going to make a difference to whether the process type turns out to be reliable or not, right? So if we are talking about whether my belief that there's a mug of tea next to me is reliably formed, well, how did I come to have that belief? I guess let's say I came to have it by seeing it. How do we tell that that is reliably formed? Well, is it produced by a reliable process? Well, what's the process, right? The process is either going to be vision, or more broadly, we could say it's perception, or more narrowly, we could say it's, you know, vision in a good lighting conditions, vision on a Tuesday, et cetera, right? And depending on which of those process specifications you pick, you might get different answers for how reliable things are. And what bothered me about the way that the intuition debate kind of worked was that we were focusing on something very broad, intuition, which seemed to me a little bit more akin to something like perception, right? It's sort of an umbrella term for a lot of different processes that at the psychological level are presumably quite different from one another. I'm guessing that most people would agree that different perceptual subtypes have differing levels of reliability, right? We might think that our vision is more reliable than our sense of smell or something like that. And it just seemed intuitive to me that intuition is going to be very much the same, right? Like it's odd to me to think that my logical intuitions are going to have the same degree of reliability as my ethical intuitions, or, you know, my mathematical intuitions, or whatever. So if you carve up those processes more finely and ask, okay, not is intuition reliable, but is moral intuition reliable? Is logical intuition reliable? You might get different answers, and that seemed to me to be a better way to frame things, right? To take the narrower approach.
Right. Yeah. So this is something to emphasize. I think you and I are familiar with this, but like, what sorts of outputs count as intuitions? And you mentioned ethical, you mentioned logical. And so when I see people give like a list of paradigmatic intuitions, you'll see this just whole panoply of different sorts of stuff. 2 + 2 = 4.
Yep.
Like torturing babies is wrong, is morally wrong. You'll see epistemic stuff, modal stuff, metaphysical stuff, linguistic stuff. Like,
Yeah.
you just see this massive array of things where they might look disunified from the outside, but to people that like study philosophy, they don't look disunified to me. Like, I get the sense that, yeah, they're the sorts of things that you get this hunchy feeling about, this intuition-y thing about. So they might be unified in terms of their phenomenology, or in
Right.
other words, the sort of subjective experience of like what it's like to entertain the proposition, and how one feels about it, what experience one has about it. But outputs of processes, like, just because the outputs seem to have a similar phenomenology, this doesn't mean that they're all produced by the same underlying cognitive processes, which may be opaque, they're not directly accessible to us.
Yeah,
And that
absolutely.
seems really, really important. And so maybe something that could be mentioned is this perspective that they really are all the product of one process. Isn't that something that Beeler proposes? Is that it's like a natural kind, that it's something like that? Or maybe, sorry, I shouldn't say Beeler proposes this. I know you in the article, you emphasize that they often talk as if this is what they think.
Yes.
And yet in practice, it may or may not be that they actually operate that way.
Yeah. So people do kind of default to talking about this as if it were a single sort of cognitive process type. Now, I think with Beeler specifically, because he's interested in characterizing this as a propositional attitude, I don't know if that necessarily commits him to the idea that there's one identical process type underneath, right? So, propositional attitudes in general are very broad, right? Belief is a propositional attitude, but of course nobody's going to think that there's only one type of cognitive process that leads to belief, right? Or at least, that that's the right way to individuate processes, right? Surely it's much more informative to think more narrowly about the processes that produce belief. And if you think about it more narrowly, there are just going to be, hugely different types of processes that lead to belief. So I guess one question that we might think about is, for the purposes of evaluating the epistemic status of intuition, or maybe just the status of intuition within philosophy, is it better to think of this broad phenomenological kind, or is it better to think of the possibly quite varying cognitive processes that lead to states that have this phenomenological character? And I got to say, for me, the phenomenology doesn't have super obvious epistemic import. Maybe I should walk that back a little bit, because I guess you could claim like having this phenomenology itself is what justifies you. That might be a route to go, but if you're focused on reliability, then I think it's going to be a slightly different question, right? So it might be, okay, I've got this seeming phenomenology that's very strong, and that gives me a sort of prima facie justification. But then if I later find out that the cognitive process that led to this very strong sense of seeming was massively error prone, well, it seems like that's going to undermine this prima facie justification, right? And that seems to be something that is really what experimental philosophers are interested in, right? Are the processes behind this error prone? And I don't think you're going to get any sense of that just on the basis of what the phenomenology of having an intuition is like.
Right. So you have these at least two possible competing hypotheses about the processes. One could be that there's a general process. My impression is that maybe the people talking about this were focused on they had other priorities. Like
I think that's exactly right. It's just not something people thought about as carefully. So I don't think I've ever caught anybody, in the literature saying there is definitely one cognitive process that underlies all intuitions, right? I've never seen anybody claim that. But if you thought more in the way that I was emphasizing in the paper, right, that there were multiple different cognitive processes underlying, then it's just a little bit of a puzzle to me why you would ask, is intuition as a whole reliable?
Yeah, I think you compare it to asking something like, is thinking reliable?
Yeah, right, exactly. That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah, which if it's not obvious or intuitive why that would be silly, obviously certain types of thinking would be completely reasonable. Like if you're doing basic arithmetic, you're like, well, I think if you add 2 and 2, but then other sorts of thinking could be completely based on wildly biased emotions. My friend didn't commit that crime. Well, you're not in a good position to judge that.
Right, exactly.
So it's going to be, or whatever it might be. So obviously, thinking is going to vary. Thinking in what way, about what, using what process, under what conditions. So this is very much the same way. So then, it's at least a possible hypothesis that there's one process, but should we just discard that as like, okay, but maybe our default assumption should be that there's probably a heterogeneous set of processes, and then the question is like, what are those processes?
I mean, maybe at the very, very beginning of investigation into this, it might have been plausible to think there was one cognitive process underlying all of these types of intuition. But I think, where we're at with our understanding of the psychology of these things, it seems implausible, right? And maybe we were going to get into this later, but I think there's several different ways that we can kind of look for evidence that would support the idea that there's multiple different processes going on here. And one of these is, are these abilities, can you selectively damage these abilities, right? Can these abilities come apart, right? And I don't want to talk too deeply about this because I'm not a psychologist, and so I might get a little out of my depth. But you do have things like impaired mathematical cognition in some people who have lesions in particular parts of their brain, or you've got psychopaths that at least seem to have something going wrong with their moral cognition, right? And insofar as it seems like some types of intuition are capable of dissociation from others, then it seems like it's a reasonable hypothesis to think that there's multiple different processes underlying those.
Right. Yeah, and we don't have to get too much into the specifics of that. You offer a number of examples in your article. So if somebody's interested, they could check out the article where you get into more detail about those. I mean, I could say like I'm somewhat familiar with these, but there are some interesting complications here. So one of the things you mentioned is that some processes, it's not a question of selective damage, but the sort of operational context. So something like vision, how do
Yeah.
we trust the process of vision? Well, if a person says I observed a cup right in front of me, that's very different from someone observing an apparent object moving through the woods, 300 meters away, as they're passing, and they're like, I swear it was Bigfoot. That's a
Yeah.
very different situation. So that's
Yeah.
one context. But maybe there's a couple others you can mention, like how impairment, there's like selective impairment, how one thing can be impaired, but it could impair something downstream or not do so. But then there's also like double dissociation. So
Mm-hmm.
could you
Mm-hmm.
mention some of the ways that we might, like in a general sense, identify evidence of specialized function of different sorts of intuitions?
Right. So what I take it you're getting at is you could have a dissociation that you knock out one sort of process and it doesn't just have immediate consequences, but it also knocks out something downstream, right? Without necessarily giving us evidence that those are sort of the same process, right? So if you knock out my vision, several of my other abilities are going to be impaired, or if you knock out my hearing, my language. My language understanding capacities are going to be impaired, but that doesn't show that they're the same sort of process, right? But if you have something like a double dissociation where you can get damage in capacity A without damage in capacity B, and damage in capacity B without damage in capacity A, then my understanding, I feel like I'm talking to a psychologist, I'm out of my depth here, but that's better evidence for the idea that these are distinct.
Yeah, I will say my training is in social psychology, so it's not
Fair
cognitive
enough.
psychology or neuroscience.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even within psychology, we have specializations where I could speak out of total ignorance. Like if you start talking about damage to the ventromedial prefrontal
Mm.
cortex or something like that, I'm not the person to talk to. We need to get Josh Greening to
Right.
talk about that.
Right. Well,
Um,
the thing is, I don't want to pretend that I've got credentials here either, because this was 10 years ago written paper, and I was probably a little out of my depth at the time. But
well,
I don't think we need a huge amount of psychology to get the intuitiveness of this, though, right? I mean, it just seems like, how could the exact same process produce the intuition that modus ponens is valid, and the intuition that murdering babies for fun is not cool? It just seems like completely different. Like, what process could it be that produced both of those things, other than like a magical sort of process that offered direct insight into some sort of magical platonic heaven? I mean, when you sort of put that idea aside as a little bit goofy, then I'm not really sure like how it could be a single process.
right. Yeah. So, the other thing to emphasize here is, even if we didn't know the specific details, and a lot of these details are still being worked out. It's not
Oh,
like,
definitely.
like Green's dual process model of moral cognition. He proposed that. There was lots of cool and interesting evidence for it. It got a lot of pushback and challenges. He's responded to those. These literatures are also emerging, and just as the metaphilosophical discourse is emerging, that there's been a lot of pushback against early like fMRI research and the
Yeah. Right.
incautious use of
Mm-hmm.
it. So a lot of things remain up in the air. I always tell students, like this is a topic, like these areas, this intersection of philosophy and psychology, where there's so much unexplored territory. It's like, if you were an explorer discovering that
Yeah.
there's a whole new continent, there's so much to discover here. So it actually
Yeah. Yeah.
it energizes me. I don't like when a topic feels like it's so overexplored. We're looking for the little scraps. There's a lot to do here.
Definitely. There's still a lot of low hanging fruit, as it were.
Right. Yeah, it's an odd experience I had as a graduate student in psychology, not in philosophy so much, of saying, well, certainly somebody's run a study on that.
Yeah.
And then you find out, no,
Nope.
no one's ever run a study on this particular question. You're like, how would no one ever do that?
Right.
And it's weird. There's a ton of studies to run. And
Yeah,
especially because of
definitely.
psychology's replication crisis, a lot of the old
Mm.
studies are getting overturned. So
Right.
yeah, so even entirely aside from knowing the specific details, it just is an empirical question, like which
Yes.
processes are involved, and philosophers ignore that at their peril. Would be
Yeah.
what I would have to say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I do feel like the burden of proof is probably on the person who wants to ignore this question, right? And just run with the idea that we can treat intuition as a monolithic kind. It seems like the hypothesis that there's a gigantic variety of different cognitive capacities underlying these judgments seems to be plausible enough that I don't think you can get away with just kind of treating intuition as a whole without any further comment.
Right. So, if we operate under the assumption that there's some degree of heterogeneity of the processes involved in intuitions, my guess is it would probably be a lot. I don't know where you stand. Would you say that there's probably a lot of heterogeneity?
I think it's a lot. Yeah, I think it's.
Yeah. So
but I mean, again,
so,
it kind of, you can divide things more narrowly and more finely, right? So I mean, you could subdivide processes in a super fine-grained way, and the question is like, what's more beneficial for metaphilosophical purposes? A fine-grained carving of process types, or a more moderate-grained carving, or a very broad carving. And one thing that I think is that the answer that you give as like an epistemologist who's working on reliabilism as a epistemological theory, right? Like the answer you give to this sort of generality issue of how do you carve up the process types, the answer an epistemologist might give and the answer a metaphilosopher might give don't need to be the same, and I think they're unlikely to be the same. I think for purposes of metaphilosophy, a finer grained carving, when we can do so, is likely to be more informative, right? Because we're not just asking like, is this a potential source of knowledge ever? We're asking, okay, is this capacity used in the right way by philosophers? Can we improve its usage? Can we be more aware of the contexts in which it errs, et cetera, et cetera? And so it seems like if we're trying to really come up with recommendations for how to proceed in reliance on intuition, the more fine-grained we can get, the better, because you're just going to have more information about the ways in which different sub-processes differ in their tendency to err in certain contexts, etc.
right. But, it does make me think in some cases, a fairly fine-grained approach does have potential philosophical relevance. And Josh Green is a good test case of this, because he's not talking about moral intuition as opposed to non-moral intuition. He says, no. Moral intuition actually has at least these two subtypes,
Yes.
one of which is more reliable than the other. And he has a whole argument.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
that
absolutely.
seems like that should matter.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you really think about it, any factor that could affect reliability might be something that kind of pushes us to try to carve the domain a little more finely here, right? I mean, yeah, are we talking about moral intuitions about family or moral intuitions about friends, right? Maybe that's a factor that affects things. Maybe we're likely to be a little bit, more generous in our moral intuitions towards family members or something like that. And once we know that, it might make sense to say, okay, well, friend-related intuition is more or less reliable than family-related intuition, even if those aren't really plausibly like psychological kinds. At the very least, we can give a more complex, more nuanced picture of, okay, under such and so circumstances, intuitions are reliable. Under such and so circumstances, they're not. And that seems like a much better way to approach the metaphilosophical issues than just saying, okay, here's our question: intuition, reliable or not reliable? Right? That's the most like kind of blunt question you could ask. But the more interesting questions are: can we piece out the cases in which this is can we piece out the judgments that seem to be pretty solid from the ones that seem to be pushed around by all kinds of irrelevant factors, or which are just in general error prone, et cetera, et cetera? Can we kind of sort these in a way that's going to help us be better philosophers?
Right. So, what are some of the ways that you could sort them? I know you suggest in the paper that one way is by content. So, and you reference like epistemological versus moral, but are there other ways or other methods that you could use to
Yeah.
sort or categorize intuitions or the processes involved in them?
So the content one is really kind of the roughest possible heuristic, right? Because I think probably you're not going to get, very straightforwardly like the epistemology module in the brain, the philosophy of mind module in the brain, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to be that clean. So, even with something like the green stuff we were just talking about, we could make a distinction between moral judgments that activate emotions in a strong way versus those that are more impersonal. So you could appeal to all kinds of different features of the psychology, like how much emotional processing is involved, whether or not this is something that maybe relies heavily on heuristics, whether or not this is, what heuristics do these processes rely on, right? So you might be able, but the more you do this, right, the more you're going to need a pretty clear picture of what's going on at the psychological level, which we probably don't have yet. So one reason to maybe start by thinking about content is just that's at least accessible to us, right? I know whether my intuition is an intuition about logic or an intuition about ethics. I might not know whether my intuitions are, based on, heuristic A, heuristic B, or heuristic C, right? I might need a lot more psychology to tell me what's going on there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, the latter point, which is that an output with the same phenomenology or about the same content could in principle be produced by different processes. And so we
Definitely,
can't
yeah.
just rely on the assumption that, hey, it's an intuition in logic, therefore it relies on a
Exactly.
specific identified process. Maybe there's 4 different processes and it's not introspectively accessible which one of them is operative. And if so, that seems like that could create some challenges for people because they can't just rely on the fact that their intuition is about this thing to say,
Definitely.
well, since we know intuitions about that thing are reliable, therefore
Yeah.
my judgment in this case is reliable, or my intuition in this case is reliable. They might be at a loss as to know which specific process was operative. I don't know. Is
Mm-hmm.
that a plausible concern?
Yeah, I think that's a huge concern. I mean, I think if you just generally think about what's going on with intuitions, if they have any unifying feature at all, maybe the phenomenology, I mean, that's a little debatable, but if there is any sort of feature that's really definitive of intuition, I would say it's something like the inability to access the reasons behind the judgment, right? So something I've sometimes thought of calling it opacity, right? So these judgments are opaque to consciousness in a certain way. You don't know why you intuited what you did, right? And now I forgot why I was talking about. Oh yeah, right. So I think this actual feature of intuition, this sort of opacity to conscious awareness of what's going on, is maybe the only sense in which we can make any generalization about intuitions epistemologically. But maybe not necessarily about their reliability, but just about, okay, well, if intuitions are kind of opaque in this way, it seems like that's a bit of an epistemological problem, right? Maybe they're reliable, but we don't know because we don't have access to what's going on, right? We don't have access to the actual calculations that went into having this intuition. So even if even if I intuit something and I reliably intuited it, the fact that this intuition is kind of opaque to me is an epistemological downside because I don't have easy access to the reliability of this judgment.
Yeah, one concern that raises for me, and this is something that I've sometimes argued with people about that are like really gung ho on intuitions, is given the opacity of the processes involved, I sometimes worry about overlap with or bleed into already well identified and understood cognitive processes. So, for instance, in a case of judging that 2 plus 2 equals 4, I've seen this presented multiple times as a paradigmatic philosophical intuition. But my understanding is that there's quite a bit of research. I don't study math cognition, but my reaction to 2 + 2 = 4 is that that's just something I memorized or learned in school, and
Hmm.
I feel like I'm relying on memory or recall
Right,
in that
right.
case. And the same thing might be happening, although it might rely on somewhat different cognitive processes in certain sorts of applications of like sort of semantic intuitions. Is again, you might be just drawing on your memory of how a term is used. And so
Yeah.
if in those cases the process involved is opaque to you, but it's memory, uh, is it reasonable to call that an intuition? I do wonder about that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I have been kind of interested in this feature of intuitions that they seem to be opaque, but obviously they're not the only mental states that are opaque, right? When I have a memory come to mind, I may not know why. I may not have access to sort of the exact cognitive mechanisms underlying that either, right? So in a sense, almost every mental state I have is going to be to some degree opaque unless it results from like a chain of conscious reasoning, which we don't really actually do all that often. Um, so yeah, I mean, then the question might be, okay, so suppose it is a memory rather than an intuition. Um, does it matter philosophically speaking? Maybe. I mean, another thing that this points to is the very same proposition, right, might be intuitive to two people in the sense that they both have this sort of phenomenology, like, yeah, that's got to be right. But the reason why it feels that way to two different people might be different, right? There might be one person who's memorized a certain fact at school and has internalized it so much that they now get this phenomenology when they think about it. But there might be another person who reasons their way consciously to it, or who has some other sort of mechanism underlying that phenomenology, right? So I don't think we can even say, like, for a given intuition like 2 + 2 = 4, the cognitive process underlying the sort of intuitiveness of that is X or Y, because it might be X for Jane and Y for Ahmed, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that seems right to me. And math problems for somebody that is maybe very good at mental math or that has studied math a whole lot. If I ask, okay, like let's just say I give them a number like 51, and I say, is that a prime number? Maybe it's not. I don't think it is. So I'm trying to think of something that's a prime number off the top of my head that's like pretty high up there, where you'd
Oh
have to
yeah,
like.
okay.
Okay, so someone that's an expert at math might have all the primes memorized out in at least in the double digits, but
Yeah.
I don't. So I
Hmm.
might have to think about it and go, is that divisible by 3? I think it is. Whereas they might go, yeah, that's prime. So
Yeah.
they're relying on memory, and I might actually have to rely on a conscious chain of thinking. And then there might be some intermediate case where a person uh, kind of remembers, but not really. They haven't thought about it in a while, and then they go, yeah, that's a prime number.
Yeah.
And so it looks like there's a whole like continuum of
Yeah, and then
possible
you have like
possibilities.
mathematical savants who can just see it, as it were, even if they've never
Right, yeah.
considered it
So
before.
then you get really weird stuff like synesthesia. I don't even know how
Oh
that's going
yeah.
to factor into this. Okay, that's too much of a digression. That stuff is fascinating, though. Yeah, if someone literally says, "Well, the number 7 is purple, so that's why."
Obviously.
That's so that's going to make things complicated too. That's actually a general point that interests me is, and sorry to deviate a bit, but
Oh,
maybe
no
you have
worries.
some thoughts on this. Uh, is I'm really interested in the cognitive diversity of people doing philosophy in general. So you have people with aphantasia, you have people
Mm.
that don't have an internal monologue. Um,
Mm.
do you? Maybe it's a bit too much off, but I don't know. I'm just curious. I think that stuff is potentially interesting both philosophically and methodologically, and also I just find it intrinsically interesting. Do you have any thoughts on like cognitive diversity and how that is relevant to philosophy?
Well, I haven't thought about that in particular, but I'm trying to think of the most adjacent thing that I have thought about, which is sort of the actual phenomenology of doing philosophy in some ways. Like, if I've got a part of my paper that I'm stuck on, right? Like, I'm writing and I run into like a counterexample or a counter argument or something. How do I work through it, right? Um, Often a lot of that is completely unconscious, at least for me, right? I just kind of leave it to marinate, and then I wake up the next day and maybe I have an idea. I don't often have the experience of step-by-step consciously going through various options, et cetera, et cetera. It's usually like a bit more intuitive, right? And this isn't even at the level of what we normally think of as intuitions, as like, you know, here's the thought experiment, is this a case of knowledge or not? But something more like, okay, here's a counter argument to my argument, how do I deal with it? Even the process of going through something like that is not entirely transparent to me, right? I haven't talked to a lot of other people about their actual phenomenology of sort of solving philosophical problems, but I'm betting for a lot of people, it's less conscious than we might initially think. Is that kind of what you were
exactly
looking
what
for?
it's like for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I used to, when I was a graduate student, I had almost like a marker board wallpaper that I
Mm-hmm.
put up on a wall, because thoughts would come to me so randomly as
Yeah.
resolutions to problems or things I was thinking
Yes.
through,
Yeah,
that I'd
definitely.
wake up in the middle of the night and write. So
Yeah.
often I'd wake up and write in the dark on the board, like some thought that occurred to me, and go back to sleep. This was an occasion of amusement for my roommates at the time, who were also philosophy grad students, because sometimes the things I would write would be incomprehensible. Like it would just say
Yeah.
like Nietzsche's foot or something, and I'm just like, I don't know what that means.
You wake up the next day and you're like, what?
Yeah, so I have some brilliant insight. The next day, it's just completely
It's gone.
incomprehensible gibberish. But that is how problems. Like a lot of times now, just because of it's like the heyday of phones.
Mm.
I'm always emailing myself. Like here's
Mm-hmm.
the so yeah. I don't sit there and go, okay, step one, they say
Yeah,
this. Step
exactly.
two, I say that. Instead,
Yeah.
I go, oh, how am I going to respond to that? I'm not sure. And then just randomly during the day, I'm like, there it is. Like it
Yeah.
bubbles out
Yeah.
involuntarily in my mind, and I have to go rush to. So I'm always
Yeah.
running to a keyboard to start writing stuff down. So that is my experience. I don't know if anybody has done a kind of a philosophical methodological ethnography of going around interviewing philosophers about
Mm.
this, but I think you would get. I think what you would find personally, and I'm curious what you would find, is a fascinating combination of both similarity, like you and I both seem to have a similarity in that respect,
Mm-hmm.
but also unusual differences, like a person that just totally does things differently, or maybe a
Yeah.
person that writes things down in a sequential. Like I'm guessing you would find quite a lot of heterogeneity and overlap and similarity. What do you think?
I think so. I mean, it's hard because I think our access to what's going on phenomenologically is actually not maybe as clear as we like to think it is. I mean, I'm a little skeptical of introspection in general. And one kind of thing that I think you were mentioning before, people who don't have like an inner monologue, right, when they think.
Mhm.
I've seen plenty of claims to this effect, and I always wonder, like, maybe we're just describing what's going on in our heads in different ways, right? Because I sort of think about it like, do I have an inner monologue? Well, it doesn't really feel like, you know, a sort of sub-vocalization going on when I'm thinking all the time. It's usually a little bit kind of quicker, but does it have a sort of linguistic content? It feels like it does, but then, you know, when I try to really introspect what's going on, when I go through a thought process, it kind of slips through my fingers. You know, I find it very difficult to actually introspect that process. And so I'm wondering if some of the variation could be people just struggling to describe something that's to some degree a little ineffable. That said, I mean, maybe there is a lot of variation. It's really hard to know. And I think our introspective abilities can only take us so far here. Which, you know, to bring things back a little bit, it's one of the reasons why I'm not a super huge fan of the phenomenological conceptions of intuition, just because I think, I mean, is my phenomenology of having an intuition the same sort of thing as your phenomenology? I mean, it's hard for me to introspect these states to start with. Some people like Williamson claim that they don't even feel any sort of phenomenology when they have an intuition. Is Williamson's, you know, is Williamson's cognitive experience when he has an intuition different from Beeler's, or are they just describing the same experience in different ways? It's very hard to know, and I think intuition is such a crappy tool to try to figure it out.
Yeah, you know, phenomenology is one of my biggest interests here. So I'd like to ask you about that. I will comment a little bit on. So with as far as the internal monologue notion, I do know someone has proposed a name that's starting to gain traction for what to call that. But in the case of mental imagery, my understanding is
Mm.
there is growing empirical research showing that on average, at least, people that report having less or no mental imagery do show like neurophysiological indicators of this, and there
Yeah,
are some functional differences.
right.
But I doubt it's 100% of them. So I do think you're
Hmm.
going to find cases of people that report having being somewhere on the spectrum of mental imagery, but maybe they're just misplacing where they are on that spectrum,
Yeah,
uh, due in
right.
part to introspective difficulties. But with inner monologue, I don't know.
Yeah,
So that it's got to be handled case by case, which is what makes
yeah.
it really frustrating. Uh,
Yeah, I
but
feel like
on the
it's a little
phenomenology,
easier to pin down the mental imagery because mental imagery is so much like the actual experience of seeing, right? There's so many similarities between entertaining a mental image and actually seeing the mental image that I think I can be pretty confident when I say I do have mental images. I feel a little less confident when I say something like I have an inner monologue because I do
mhm.
feel like the majority of my thinking doesn't really feel like an inner monologue, but maybe I'm just miscategorizing it. It's hard to know.
Yeah, some of mine does, and some maybe not. I'm not sure. But
Mhm.
the mental imagery one, maybe it's just more tractable. Have you ever gone through the Dan Dennett type of thought experiments, like with Tiger and that sort of thing?
I'm not sure if I know what you're referring to.
So,
The
this is something that he would do in his classes where he would ask you to imagine a cow, and then he'd say, well, is it
Mhm.
facing left or facing right? How many
Oh
spots does
yeah,
it
yeah,
have?
yeah. Hmm.
And, I
Yeah.
do this with my students where I ask them, I'm like, all right, picture a tiger. Okay, get a really rich image, really get that mental picture in your head. And
Hmm.
I just had let them sort of saturate or marinate in thinking about that and really envisioning it. And I go, okay, how many stripes does it have? And
Yeah.
the reaction is like, "Oh, damn, I don't know." Well, if you were looking at a tiger in your mind's eye, so to speak, shouldn't you be able to see the number of stripes and
Yeah.
just count them? And yet they immediately find that most of them can't do this. But I do get different reports from students. Now, a couple of them are like, "Yeah, there's 17 or whatever."
Oh gosh.
So I do get that sometimes, but it's not
Yeah, yeah.
everybody. And
I'm a
I
little
don't know if
skeptical
they're
of
the
that.
ones that are full of baloney or it's everybody else. Who knows? But
Yeah, for my own case, I would say like, okay, so picture a tiger. It's facing left. Can I count its stripes? Not really, but I can make an estimate that it's around between 10 and 15. But I think part of the issue is that mental images are not as stable as visual images. So it may be that, for a second it was 14 and then it shifted to 15 and then it's back to 12, in a way that prevents actually precisely counting them.
But there's something strange about the phenomenology of imagining something, which is that like you could kind of do it at one layer, and it's like, oh yeah, there's
Yeah.
a tiger, I see it.
Yeah.
And then if you go a little bit deeper and you start trying to zoom in, you find that the whole thing sort of falls apart, and it has a kind of,
Yeah,
for me at least, a dreamlike quality. If I zoom in over here, the
definitely.
other parts go away, and they have to
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
reform.
Yeah,
There's something
absolutely,
weird about it.
absolutely.
But
Yeah,
I don't know what it's like for an artist because, like, I
mm,
can't draw. I have no artistic ability at all. But like, an artist can draw a detailed tiger from like memory. What the heck
mm-hmm.
is going on there? I have no
Yeah, no,
idea.
I don't know. Yeah, no. I mean, I'm willing to bet there is some level of variation between persons. But I think you do need something like more controlled studies to try to figure this out rather than just relying on self reports because yeah, I'm a little skeptical of that student who said 17 stripes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sorry if you're watching. Maybe you're right.
Yeah, I don't know the specific detail. I don't know if it was that or the cow example, but I've had people
Yeah,
report
yeah.
like having really detailed mental imagery. But part of why this interests me is because what motivated me to go into philosophy and psychology was I had this very distinct memory. I don't know how accurate the memory is because memories are not always that
Yeah.
reliable when they're years later. Uh, but I remember reading like Philippa Foot, like the trolley problem stuff, uh, and the students in the class were being prompted to report their intuitions on the matter.
Mhm.
And my reaction was that I was like, well, I have an inclination in this way, an inclination like the footbridge case. My
Mm,
reaction was, well, it would maximize utility to push the person off the footbridge,
yeah.
but I wouldn't feel good doing it. And I don't think that I would, but maybe I should. But I didn't
Yeah.
have the sense of it's wrong to push the person. Like that didn't happen. And what I experienced as an undergraduate, and this continued into graduate school, was a kind of social coercion, a kind of push to say, no,
Hmm.
but what is your intuition? And
Yeah.
often my reaction was, I don't have an intuition. I don't have a Chinese room intuition. I don't have a marriage room intuition. I just didn't have a phenomenology at all. Maybe some of this is Williamson like. I can report judgments on the matter, like, yeah, I don't think she learns anything new.
Hmm.
I can report judgments on the matter, but I have never had any distinctive phenomenology when doing philosophy. And to me, whatever it is other people reporting is quite mysterious. I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know what it is that they're reporting. Uh, and I've gotten some pushback from people that don't believe me or
Mm.
have even suggested that I have cognitive deficits as a
Whoa.
result of not having this phenomenology. Like, oh, well, you're suffering from a kind of conceptual blindness. So
Mm.
I don't, is that something you've encountered, or maybe I'm just a weird outlier? I don't know.
Well, so there have been kind of arguments in the experimental philosophy literature to the effect that philosophy can be possibly a little self-selecting, in the sense that the people who have the right intuitions are the ones that are more likely to become philosophers, right? And we could maybe expand that a little bit to say, well, the people who are very comfortable with being prompted for intuitions and feel like that methodology is very intuitive to them, might be more likely to go on and become philosophers later. Although in your case, it seems like it was a little bit the opposite, like it made you more interested in philosophy, or what do you think?
I think so, but I think I might be an outlier in which is that, there's one thing that really stands out to me. I do remember I said this, so this memory is reliable, I think. Of course, if it wasn't, I wouldn't know. I remember asking my students in one of my classes, I was like, what motivates you? Like, what makes you want to do this sort of stuff? And, I got a couple answers and I'm like, what motivates me? Anger. And so it's not the healthiest motivation, but, I got into what like philosophy in general. And then I got into meta ethics because I was frustrated. It's not like
Yes.
brimming with fury, like I'm a berserker or something, but like I was frustrated at philosophers saying, well, the folk think this, or this is what people mean. Mackey says when people make claims, they presuppose that there's these objective, mind independent moral facts.
Mhm.
How does he know that? He didn't run a study. If I look at 20th century meta ethics,
Yeah,
none of
absolutely.
R.M. Hare, A.J. Ayer, Mackey, none of them ran studies. So I got interested in the topic out of frustration. But it was also this frustration at not having this phenomenology, uh, and starting to be suspicious of it. And so, this is something, I don't know if you want to address this or not, but one thing I wonder about is whether the reported phenomenology might be, at least this is a tentative, very underdeveloped hypothesis I have, that intuition phenomenology, as reported by philosophers, might be something partially self-selected for, as you mentioned, some experimental
Yeah.
philosophers suggest. But I'm wondering if it's something that someone can be trained into or inducted into that is unique to the discipline, that it's not that ordinary people have this kind of phenomenology and then some of them gravitate towards philosophy, but rather in a certain sense that studying and reading about philosophy can actually cultivate this intuitive sense, whether
That's
it's that legitimizes it or not. I don't know if you have thoughts on
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I have not thought of this before, but it sounds extremely plausible to me, right? I mean, the immediate sort of thing that's coming to mind is something like religious experience, right? Being around a group of people who are in the midst of some sort of religious experience, you might find it easier to feel that way as well, right? And so you might think that there's a little bit of kind of I don't know what a good word for it is, but being surrounded by people who are supposedly feeling this sort of thing, you start to maybe pay more attention to what's going on in your mind and go like, oh, maybe that's it, maybe that's the intuition, and then kind of bring it out and uh, possibly even make it more likely to occur because you are sort of attending to it and trying for it, as it were. So yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think if you went to a random person on the street and said like, oh, when you consider the proposition that 2 + 2 is 4, do you have a sense of the necessity of that? Is it an intellectual seeming to you? They're going to look at you like you're a crazy person, right? So I do think that philosophers like trying to do this might make it more likely for them to have states that have these phenomenological features.
Yeah, but for me, I do wonder how much is it picking up and identifying features that are present, and how much of
Yeah.
it is a sort of acquired tendency to suppose something is there that is a sort of modification of, or alteration, or misinterpretation of something. You gave religion as an example, which I think is good. The example I've tended to float around, and I haven't like put on paper for publication anything on this, but it's something that I'm really thinking about, is people that purport to see auras.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so I don't think that there are auras in the sense that people actually have energy fields around them. But I also don't think people and there are people that claim that they could see auras around people. I don't think they're lying. I don't think that's just a
Right.
bunch of liars. I
There's
think
something in
something
their
is going on.
experience they're picking up on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's like acquired synesthesia. Like, it's possible
Hmm.
that what people are actually able to do is, and this is again very speculative, but if you get vibes from someone, like a feeling about them,
Mm.
maybe for some people this can activate part like visual processing associated with color perception, and they actually get a sense of a color. I don't know, uh,
Mm.
but it's
Hmm.
also possible that they're just straight up just misinterpreting their experiences or phenomenology, and reporting the ability to see something that's not really there.
Yeah.
And so, if that's a learned ability, uh, maybe certain kinds of philosophical intuitions are also learned abilities. And if they are, I think that might raise questions about their status. I don't think that automatically undermines them. Like, people can learn to play chess. That doesn't undermine the ability to
Yeah.
make good chess judgments. So, but something about the psychology here might not be that much of an innate process, so much as a sort of learned. It's almost like a
Acquired.
like
Yeah.
a grafted on cognitive
Yeah.
faculty.
Yeah. I was thinking what you were thinking of auras. I was thinking of wine tasting, right? So,
Mm.
if you spend a lot of time working on this ability to piece out the minute little flavors in your wine, you go like, oh yes, this tastes like grass clippings and gasoline or whatever. And I do not ever taste grass clippings and gasoline in wine, but does that mean that do I actually taste it and I just can't tell? Or are these like additional experiences that would be added on if I were to, spend a lot of time working on wine tasting? Like is the flavor
Yeah.
already being experienced and I'm not detecting that experience? Or is it something that like would be part of my experience later if I continue to try to like taste the wine carefully?
Yeah,
I
actually,
think this has got to do with the introspection thing too. I mean, I think it's so hard to tell what's going on phenomenologically in any sensation that we're having that is when it comes to intuitions, I think the problem is even worse than something like wine tasting because the phenomenology of having an intuition is so fuzzy in certain ways.
yeah, it does, and it's also maybe less systematically capable of being prompted. Like, at least with the wine
Hmm.
tasting, I could taste the same wines
Yeah,
5
yeah,
times and
right,
really,
sure.
really look for it. I just did a wine tasting, and I had that
Yeah.
experience. They're telling me this has hints of citrus or whatever.
Hmm.
Does it? So I was just going through that, like a few weeks ago. Uh,
Yeah.
I sometimes feel like, so one of them, I think they said it had like a kiwi flavor, and I thought I
Oh.
tasted kiwi, but how would it have a kiwi flavor? It's grapes. Come on.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
but the thing about that worry, like, well, it doesn't worry me because I like criticizing what philosophers are doing. But the thing I think should worry philosophers is if we could get good empirical evidence that people doing wine tasting can be easily duped, and I think we do have
yeah.
evidence
Mm,
like that.
yeah.
What does that say about the potential? Like, I think that might suggest, at least in that case, our phenomenology is not a reliable indicator of the underlying reliability of the process.
Yeah,
Maybe there's
definitely.
something funny going on there, but the reliability of the reliability, whatever. But in other words, if people can be duped in wine tasting, could they also be being duped about their phenomenology and philosophy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's kind of two ways that could happen, I guess. I mean, you could be sort of duped in the sense of thinking that there's an experience there when there actually isn't. But then, I mean, I do feel like there is this kind of self-fulfilling aspect to it where you can produce the experience inside yourself genuinely. So people
Mhm.
might actually be having this kind of seeming phenomenology, but it's not an inherent feature of the proposition they're considering, but it's rather something that they produced in themselves by whatever sort of indoctrination processes we as philosophers have undergone through the years.
Yeah, that would be really worrying because if they're taught that you have intuitions about stuff and that's an indicator of whether they're true, and then
Yeah.
they basically cause themselves to have
Yes.
an intuition that it's true, then it could be, like you said, a self-fulfilling prophecy, that it could also render them incorrigible to correction if the intuition is strong enough. And
Mhm.
this worries me when people make like Morian shifts and they'll say, any argument
Mm.
with a conclusion contrary to my intuition on the matter will
Mm.
inevitably rely on premises less plausible than the conclusion. But if the
Yeah.
conclusion is something that you sort of worked yourself up into, like a
Yeah.
wine taster, now you've sort of talked yourself into a position you can't talk yourself out of.
Oh, yeah.
That seems like a epistemological black hole that would be really scary for philosophers to potentially plunge into.
Right, definitely. Yeah, I mean, this all kind of points to, I think, at best, I think phenomenology might give you prima facie justification, like a seeming phenomenology, I mean.
Mhm.
And I think, to be fair, I think that people who have this kind of view of where the justification comes from when you're having an intuition, people who think it is because of the phenomenology, I think mostly they do think this gives you prima facie justification, but it can be undermined by all kinds of things. Yeah, so I think at best you're going to get some sort of weak prima facie justification from the phenomenology, but not enough to really ground serious philosophical work, I wouldn't think. I would think that you'd want to push for further support. I mean, I kind of want to go back to this idea of intuitions being sort of opaque in a way, right? I mean, again, you've got this intuition, you've got this feeling of seeming, but you have no idea why, or at least you maybe only have a minimal idea of why. Are you confident that you haven't talked yourself into this? Are you confident that this isn't like a product of hanging out with philosophy PhDs for 20 years or whatever? And if you're not, right, if you can't point to like what the actual process that produced that intuition was, I think that's really worrying for philosophical methodology. I think that's a real epistemic weakness that we ought to be trying to address.
Yeah, I can imagine though, like very rationalistically inclined philosophers, maybe someone like Mike Humer, that are not going to be very moved by this.
Hmm.
And I get a lot of these. I see a lot of these claims like, we have to rely on intuitions.
Yes.
Any alternative is self-defeating. We have no choice. Some of them might treat intuitions in this almost quasi-perceptual way. Some of them treat the functioning or the utility of intuitions as so obvious that it's not even something that they could or would seriously question. They might treat questioning it a bit like an astronomer would treat someone proposing that the Earth is flat. They're just like, look, this is it. There's kind of like when people talk about consciousness. Nothing is more obvious than that we're conscious. Well,
Mm-hmm.
nothing might be more obvious to some philosophers than that. They have intuitions, they use intuitions, and they rely on intuitions. Uh, you know, what do you make of that? Because I don't know if you've seen this occur. I certainly
Yeah,
have.
yeah, definitely.
Like, how do we address that? I don't know how to get someone like that to reconsider or be more skeptical. Maybe there isn't a way to do that.
So, I mean, there's a grain of truth to that, right? I mean, there is no way to completely abandon all intuitions, right? You're going to have to use them somewhere. But for any given intuition, there might be alternate ways of defending a certain point, right? So if you take like the intuition that Gettier cases are not knowledge, you could just, read Gettier's cases, have the intuition, and go, okay, Gettier cases are not knowledge, done. Or you could, go through a more careful line of reasoning and try to think about why you might have that intuition, try to think about whether the intuition presumably has got something to do with the accidental nature of the truth of your belief, right? And so you might be able to develop further lines of argument about why accidentally formed true beliefs are, incompatible with knowledge. I mean, you can take this further, right? You can, instead of resting content with the intuition, you can look for different routes to justify the same conclusion. You're not going to be able to do that for every use of intuition ever, but you might be able to overall reduce your reliance on intuition to some degree by following that kind of a strategy. And insofar as one can do that, I think it's worth doing because conclusions grounded on sort of less opaque um, justificatory sources, I think are all things being equal, going to be stronger. So I wouldn't. I'm not one of these people who thinks like, oh, we have to throw out intuition from philosophy. I think that's a goofy thing to say because, good luck, right? But it does seem to me like there's a lot we can do to sort of reduce our use of intuition.
That's perfect. It's the last thing I wanted to ask you about, which is that towards the end of the paper, you talk about the use of the term intuition, and you say something along the lines of like, these considerations are not reasons to abandon intuition or stop using the notion of an intuition as a technical term, but they're, one thing, and I think I would be drawn towards this perspective, is to at least question whether we should be using the term intuition. So, if intuition refers to these 17 different processes, and three of them are memory, and two of them operate in a completely different way than the rest of them, and five of them have this totally different function or whatever. They're really affected by emotions, and the others aren't. To
Yeah.
me, I would worry that, and also on top of that, people speaking of it in general terms versus more fine-grained terms, people speaking of it in terms of beliefs and dispositions and propositional attitudes. It's at least possible that someone, I think, could argue that the term intuition is defective and ought to be abandoned. Do you think that there would be any stock to that, or you wouldn't go in for that? What would you make of that?
I mean, I think it would definitely be reasonable to substitute more carefully defined terms where possible, right? So if you want to say like, okay, I mean, there might be instances where you might want to appeal to a particular type of logical cognition, right? And it might be better to just not say intuition there, but to say something and refer to the more specific cognitive type. But there might, I mean, we do have umbrella terms for very heterogeneous processes, right? Like perception is a term that applies to a whole range of different cognitive processes. And there might be an argument that intuition ought to be something similar, right? It's a very broad term. It might be less useful than we thought because it is so broad, but there might be contexts in which it makes sense to clump all of these states together, right? I mean, it's just a higher level term like, animal versus dog versus, poodle, right? There's reasons to having categories at each of these levels of grain. The question is like, what is the higher level category useful for? I don't think it's useful for sort of doing a careful evaluation of our methods as philosophers. It's too blunt for that. But there might be other contexts in which it does make sense to keep the broad term.
Yeah, that makes sense. I do worry in some cases, and this would extend in cases where I'm perfectly comfortable with the term, like perception. You will see people extend perception to other things. So people talk about moral perception, like
Yeah.
perceiving
Mm-hmm.
moral facts, and that doesn't sit right with me. I don't think I wouldn't describe perception in that way, because for me, perception seems to involve like sensory faculties that are responsive to like physical features of the world, and the idea of
Mm-hmm.
talking about perceiving something a priori just strikes me as very strange. It seems like an overextension of the term, and I can imagine even if we conserve a careful use of the term intuition, in the same way there might be a perpetual risk. Not that this means we stop using a term, of misusing or overextending it in infelicitous ways. I don't know. Do you agree? Disagree?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the problems here is with intuition, there is so much disagreement over what characterizes the broad category as a whole, right? I mean, is it the phenomenology? Is it the nature of the target as being something a priori? Is it something else? I think that the best sort of feature that might unify the category is something like opacity, but I don't expect everybody's going to agree with me on that, and so unless we have an agreed upon definition, there's always going to be the risk that people apply it to things that may be controversial as to whether it would count. Right.
Okay. Last thing on this note that I want to ask about, and then we'll wrap it up there is, yeah. So that is an approach that is really agreeable to me. And, this is something that, when we look at terminology, it's often strange how people, especially in philosophy, almost get dragged along by their sense of what the terms mean without appreciating, to a significant extent, the terms, we don't serve the terms serve us. Like we can just
Mhm.
say, let's all collectively agree to use this term for this and that term for that. And we can sort of regiment our language, at least in technical contexts. We can jargonize terms, even if they have ordinary language analogs, in ways that serve our purposes. But I don't know how to go about doing that. Like, you could write a paper saying, let's all use intuition to refer to opacity, but
Yeah,
good luck convincing people. Do you think,
sure.
and I know you do work in conceptual engineering, which we're not going to have time much to talk about, but is that one of like the goals of conceptual engineering? Is it this
Yeah,
like practical project? And
yeah.
maybe we could end on you saying a little bit about that,
Yeah.
and then we'll leave it there.
Good. Perfect. That's great. That's a perfect way to end. So yes, exactly. Right. One of my attractions to conceptual, so maybe I should back up and say a little bit about what conceptual engineering is, but it is basically this project that you were kind of giving an example of, right? Deciding how to use a term rather than trying to look at the ordinary language usage and capture that with the theory, right? So yeah, I mean, here's two ways that you could go about defining intuition. You could, look at the usage among ordinary persons, non-philosophers, or you could look at the usage among philosophers and try to come up with an analysis that perfectly captures how that works. Or you could say, forget that. I am interested in a certain type of state, the type of state that is, that its production is opaque to consciousness. Okay, and I don't care whether that matches the way the ordinary person on the street is talking about intuition. I think that this category has epistemological importance for such and so reason, and so maybe I'll call it intuition, or maybe I'll call it intuition sub one. Who cares? We can choose which terms we're going to use and their contents, right? Just by stipulating jargon, essentially. I think that's worth doing because I don't see any particular reason why, the way ordinary folks have talked about intuition should constrain the way philosophers think about metaphilosophy. Just to kind of end on how I see these fields kind of interacting. One reason why I am so interested in conceptual engineering is exactly because of my sort of general moderate skepticism about intuitions. Right, I do think that there are a whole bunch of reasons to try to minimize usage of intuition, like we were discussing before. Right? You're not going to be able to completely get rid of every use of intuition ever, but in some cases you might be able to develop arguments in favor of using a term one way or not. And those kind of arguments just are conceptual engineering, right? So if I take something like knowledge and I say, okay, I have this intuition that Gettier cases aren't knowledge, but let me actually think through why it would make sense for a Gettier case to either be in the category of knowledge or outside of the category of knowledge. And then I think, okay, well, why do I even need this term knowledge? What is this term doing for me? What purposes does it serve? Given the purposes that this concept serves for me, would it better serve those purposes if it excluded Gettier cases, or would it better serve those purposes if it included Gettier cases? And then forget what the intuitions say about Gettier cases. Make the decision on the basis of types of reasoning that are explicit and that you can point to reasons for and against. And at the end of the day, you might end up with a concept of knowledge that departs from the way a standard English speaker would use it, but who cares, right? So I do think that the end point of all of this, if you kind of have the same skepticism about intuition that I do, is you want to start looking for an alternate methodology, one that tries to replace intuitions with something else when you can, right? With maybe the understanding that that's not going to ever be complete. And I think conceptual engineering is a very plausible sort of successor methodology here.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. I mean, that could be a topic in its own right. So I think that's a perfect place to end. Thanks so
Cool.
much for having this conversation.
Yeah,
I
it's
had
been
a good
real
time.
fun.
Yeah,
I
this
had a
is
great
great.
time.
Yep.
Great.
So
Thanks so much.
I could put a link to the article we discussed in the description, and then whatever else you tell me I should put in there, I'll throw a link in the description so people could find you and your work. And with that,
Cool.
thanks everybody, and we will stop there. Thanks so much.